Global Conservation Corps presents the RHINO Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of RHINO Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Timothy Santel. Tim is currently the Senior Advisor on International Wildlife Trafficking programs for Focus Conservation, which is a nonprofit changing the game in the battle against wildlife crime through investigations, government support, and information sharing. Tim spent over 33 years working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and retired as a special agent in charge of their Special Investigations Unit. Tim developed and oversaw a team of elite covert federal agents tasked with investigating transnational criminal organizations that were illegally trafficking wildlife. In recognition of his efforts, Tim received numerous awards throughout his career, including the prestigious Guy Bradley Award, Samuel J. Heyman Service to America Medal, and North American Wildlife Officer of the Year. In this conversation, we go deep into the work being done at Focus Conservation, why what they are doing is important to the cause, and how you can support. We dive into Tim's progression from growing up in a rural Midwestern town in the U.S. to becoming a law enforcement agent with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We go into many of his experiences on the job and investigations, including Operation Crash, which resulted in nearly 50 prosecutions globally for trafficking in rhino horns and elephant ivory. Tim is generous with his stories and his wisdom. So without further ado, here's my wide-ranging conversation with Timothy Santel. All right, Tim, welcome to the RHINO Man podcast. It's a real honor to have you on here.
Well, thanks. Appreciate it. It's exciting to actually get the chance to talk to you, and especially after the recent release of your film, The RHINO Man. I'm excited to talk about not only rhinos, but wildlife conservation and the issues of wildlife trafficking and how they impact critters around the world.
Absolutely, and yeah, thank you for that. We're just finally getting to the very beginning of rolling this film out and got selected to Jackson Wild Media Awards, which is really exciting, and then hoping to have some more festival screenings and eventually get it out there in a big way so people can see it. But yeah, I'm excited to chat with you as well and kind of dive into a lot of your history. You have a long and impressive career with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and also with Focus Conservation, the organization you've come on recently. And we've had some, I guess, collaborations with them, or, I've met Wim a couple of times and a bunch of the team. And they've been helpful with the loss of our good friend, Anton Zimba, the ranger in the Timbavati, and helping out some around his case, and also just providing heat training for the team there so that they can be more aware of what's going on outside of the fence. Because, yeah, as you know very well, I'm sure that, when you're on the job, it could be dangerous, but it could be just as dangerous when you go home and let your guard down. So really, really important training, and we're super grateful for that. So yeah, lots to go into. I think maybe just an easy way to start is maybe just give us a very brief overview of what's kind of the main core of what you've been doing over the years and what's your new role at Focus Conservation.
Well, again, thanks. I've been involved in the wildlife conservation arena now for, really since the late 80s. Graduated with a degree in wildlife ecology from the University of Wisconsin in Stevens Point, and got hired pretty quickly after graduation and started with the Fish and Wildlife Service. And my first position with Fish and Wildlife Service was as a wildlife inspector in Boston, Massachusetts, where I was, assigned to monitor the importations, exportations, smuggling activity occurring at the border ports there in that part of the United States. I did take for a short stint. I was a wildlife biologist working on endangered species matters, and truthfully, that's what I thought I was going to be. One day I thought I was going to be a wildlife biologist, but I, became sort of disenchanted a little bit because I saw things that I thought were wrong and needed to be addressed, but I just didn't feel like I had the authority or the power to do so in my position as a biologist. And so for me, it seemed like a good fit for me to join the ranks of law enforcement, where when you see bad things happen, you can take action and under your authority. And so I was hired as a special agent for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in 1992 and worked as a special agent through the ranks all the way up into my retirement in December of 2020. During the Fish and Wildlife Service, I've been very fortunate, blessed, and really worked with some fantastic people throughout the decades, I guess, that I worked for Fish and Wildlife for almost 32 plus years. And I had some successes, had some failures, but the most important things were that we worked some important investigations that raised awareness around the globe. And for those, I'm very proud of. I mean, the main object here was to do what we could to try to protect those species that needed some help. It's sort of a saying, but those animals don't have a voice. We were their voice for them. And what we did was we tried to go after those individuals and or organizations that were involved in trafficking, illegally trafficking wildlife. And it sort of evolved over my career. In the beginning, I was more attuned to things local and regional and currently in the United States, but then that transcended to working these international investigations. And as I got experience and my reputation grew and I started getting asked to take on bigger and more important roles within the agency, the type of cases I worked became a lot larger as well. And then, that sort of moved me towards the last decade of my career. I spent overseeing the country's Special Investigations Unit for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And basically, that was an elite group of undercover agents that I was able to assemble. And our main objective was to go after the biggest threats around the globe to wildlife, transnational criminal organizations, cartels, syndicates. Sort of my marching orders to my troops when we would get together and talk about what kind of cases we wanted to work. I basically wanted them to think out of the box like I did. I think throughout my career, what sort of helped me move along was I was always trying to think out of the box and cutting edge investigations. I told my team, I said, let's do the cases that nobody else can do or nobody else thinks we can do. If they say there's no way, then let's try to see if there's a way. And so I was always encouraging to work these really hard, complex cases. And so when you do that, obviously, your successes are bigger and hopefully the little larger impact in your objective to save the species. So, we started having some pretty big successes, and I'm pretty proud of that. And as a result, there's been a lot of positive change globally. The awareness that's been raised to wildlife trafficking, I think, coincided with many of the cases that our team was working. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about some of those throughout this podcast, but I've been really lucky with my career, and I'm kind of a baseball junkie. And so when I talk, the analogies I use is with baseball, and you can have a heck of a baseball team, but if you got a whole lot of good players on your team, he really makes the manager look good. So I was lucky. I had a bunch of phenomenal agents that worked with me over the years, and they're just as passionate as I was. It really made this job a lot easier when you're surrounded by really good people. But, as I mentioned, I retired in December 2020 after a pretty successful career, but I still had the passion, and I still have a desire to do something. I tell people, while I still can and have my wits about me, I like to still contribute in some way. And that sort of led me to focus conservation and, the arena of nonprofits and NGOs working in the wildlife conservation arena. I had a lot of experience interacting with NGOs and nonprofits while I worked for Fish and Wildlife, some positive, some not so positive, but I guess I didn't envision myself working necessarily in that arena myself, but now I'm sort of on the other side of the fence working for Focus Conservation and very proud to be associated with that team. So that's kind of where I am today. I'm working there as a senior advisor on wildlife trafficking issues and kind of been brought in within the last few months to help their organization with their day-to-day operations.
Yeah, really, really amazing career spanning so many different things that I'm excited to dig into. I'm trying to think the best way to do this. I'd love to dive in more to what you guys are doing with Focus Conservation, but just thinking from the listener's perspective, maybe set up the landscape a little bit more of, maybe the best way to do it is kind of saying what you guys are doing at Focus Conservation, but also setting up the landscape of what are these situations, whether they're the syndicates or the networks, or, I think a lot of people don't even really think of illegal wildlife trade as this massive network of cartels or syndicates. People can imagine drugs or human trafficking or things like that. But for some reason, I feel like, wildlife trafficking always kind of gets left out of that equation in people's minds. Maybe there's just not enough good action films about it. I feel like, talking about some of these cases that
That'd be your next one.
yeah, exactly. Some of the cases that you've been a part of, I feel like they can make some great movies. So I feel like we need to do that. But yeah, to your best ability, maybe set up the situation, the landscape a little bit, and then what you guys are trying to do exactly with focused conservation.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when I started this job, I was anxious and I got out of the gate and, I was going to save the world and save all the animals I could. But I found myself early in my career sort of concentrating on what now I would perceive as low-level criminals. The analogy would be with a drug case, street user, someone in possession, low-level narcotics dealer, those sorts of things. And so, although they were successes, I guess, per se, it didn't take long for me to realize that was I really, or questioning myself, I guess, was I having the kind of impact that I was hoping to have on the overall population of a particular species? And so, when you start looking at it, I started to refocus my investigations not on the lower level tiers, but start progressing up the pyramid with the goal in mind of trying to apprehend, arrest, and eventually prosecute those high level criminals that ran these operations. And so once I started refocusing some of the work that we were doing, it became real apparent that this was much larger than probably not only I perceive, but probably the public at large, just from the standpoint that, wildlife crime is not thought of in the same vein as, narcotics trafficking, human trafficking, arms trafficking, and so forth. But essentially what I found is, criminals are criminals and they're opportunistic. And it doesn't really matter to a criminal organization or a cartel or a syndicate, how they profit, as long as they profit. And so whether it's a 14-year-old girl from Honduras or a caseload of AK-47s going to Russia, or a couple kilos of heroin or rhino horns, if they all made you money, the syndicates were interested in those particular commodities. And what we started to figure out was, well, you know what? We're not doing anything really different, as far as we being wildlife agents aren't doing anything really too different than what the other more known law enforcement agencies are. It's just a different commodity. I always say, take out a kilo of cocaine and insert a rhino horn, and it's the same sort of crime, same sort of players, same sort of modus operandi. It's the same thing. Unfortunately, the biggest differences are prosecutions and penalties, and that's where they fall a little bit short. But as far as how to get there, the cases are relatively the same. We do the forensics, we do crime scenes, we interview, we go through the same judicial processes. But as I mentioned, the crimes weren't necessarily the same. And so once you started looking into this, you start realizing that, wildlife crime is really, really huge. I mean, you look at, I've been involved in some pretty significant cases involving organized crime. Right before I left the Fish and Wildlife Service, my team took down a major operation called Operation Apex, and that dealt with what started off as a look into the shark fin, illegal shark finning. It sort of transcended into a much larger case that involved narcotics trafficking, international money laundering between China and Mexico, the Chinese organized crime and the Mexican cartels, and moving narcotics proceeds through legal industry. And in the Apex case, for example, involved the seafood industry or shark fins per se, legal quote, and I use the terms in air quotes, but legal shark finning. And so taking illegal proceeds from drug trafficking and funneling it through a legal business such as shark finning, and then hiding the proceeds and so forth. And that was international money laundering. And so once we started getting involved in that investigation, it became really apparent we were playing with some fairly significant criminal organizations that were involved here. And so we worked that particular case jointly with the DEA. It was labeled an OCDF case, the only OCDF case that I'm aware of for a wildlife case that was recognized.
What's OCDF mean?
That's an organized crime. It's recognition, special recognition by the Department of Justice,
Okay.
and it provides you some extra tools in your investigation if it's designated as an OCDETF case. And so you have access to, different information, intelligence, those sorts of things.
Similar to like when they're talking about cross-state borders, like RICO cases and things like that. It's just
very similar. It's a designation that's given to it. And anyway, and where I was going with this, that was just simply one of many cases like that where wildlife, there's a convergence of wildlife, we say, with other crimes. Many of these organizations, many of these groups, whether they're militant, terrorist, cartels, syndicates, whatever terminology you want to use, many of them are involved in multiple bad things, And as I mentioned, the thing about wildlife is it's more accessible at some point. The chances of getting caught are a lot less because there's a lot less of us out there than there are narcotics officers or FBI agents or DEA agents or whatever the case may be. So there's fewer fish and wildlife agents. The chances of getting caught were probably significantly less. And as I mentioned, when you do get caught and you get brought before the courts, the sentencing, the statutory language in the United States per se, is just not where it needs to be as it relates to the significance of these wildlife crimes. And so if you did get caught, the penalties would be a lot less. And so there was certainly worth the risk to a lot of these major organizations and groups to dabble in the wildlife arena. And so you see them involved in rhino horn, shark fin, as I say, pangolin scales, elephant ivory, lion bone, live tiger trade, primates. I mean, the list is endless, but they're very lucrative. And so these organizations were making a lot of money. And so where I was going with this is we sort of see this bounced around through the social media and the various platforms as it relates to kind of a regurgitation of, everybody talks about, transnational criminal organizations and wildlife is the fourth, most significant, blah, blah, blah. And that's all true. But at some point, somebody has to say, well, okay, what are you going to do about it? I can read the same regurgitated article 50 times. I can do a Google search right now. And a lot of these groups are all saying all the same thing, but it's like, well, what are you doing about it? And so that becomes the challenging part. And that's what sort of led me towards focused conservation. I actually bumped into Wim Brown. He was a DEA agent stationed in Kenya. And Wim, he was witnessing what was happening in Africa as it relates to wildlife crime, wildlife trafficking, and sort of this, the issue of corruption and how corruption in Africa was one of the biggest facilitators of wildlife crime, and this was at all levels, whether it was low level all the way up to corruption within the judicial systems there. And unfortunately, a lot of the NGOs and the nonprofits that were working in the conservation arena, although all of them have great intentions and are just as passionate as I am probably, but not many of them, hardly any, had the experience in law enforcement, how to put a case together, how to deal with corruption, how to collaborate with law enforcement agencies, how to get a case before a court and get a good prosecution and so forth. And so when I was running the Special Investigations Unit for the Fish and Wildlife Service, we initiated a case based on some intelligence we got out of Uganda. I think the case was called Operation Manhattan Project. And it was a fancy name for actually our investigation of the Mwaza Chroma syndicate. Mwaza Chroma was a well-known trafficker of rhino horn and elephant ivory and narcotics in East Africa. He operated out of Uganda. I believe he was from Liberia, had found safe haven in Uganda, and that's where he operated out of. And so we received some information intelligence from our counterparts in Uganda and Uganda Wildlife Authority, and also some NGOs who indicated Chroma was actively involved in peddling rhino horns to Southeast Asia, particularly some of the countries we typically hear, China, Hong Kong, Thailand, and in Malaysia, Singapore, those particular countries. It's a lot of rhino horn going out of Africa ends up in those locations. And so our investigation of the Chroma Syndicate kicked off in around 2017, 2018. And anyway, when we started trying to figure out how we were going to work the Mwaza Chroma Syndicate and utilize some of this intelligence that was being provided to us, we crossed paths with Wim Brown. He was a friend of our attaché, located in Tanzania at the time, in Dar es Salaam, and he became friends with Wim, and Wim sort of had an understanding of what we were doing. And so anyway, it kind of put us together. And Wim and this new organization he created called Focus Conservation, sort of in the shadows and in the background, and probably a little known fact, but he played an important and really key and critical role in helping us develop this investigation of the Mwaza Chroma Syndicate, introduced us to some potential informants. And anyway, we joined forces with the DEA and made this a joint Fish and Wildlife Service DEA bilateral investigation of the Chroma Syndicate. And so that was sort of my first introduction to Wim, and I really was fascinated by the work that Wim was doing. And then the more I learned about focus conservation, the more I realized that they were just a little different than most of the NGOs and nonprofits that I had interacted with in my official capacity with Fish and Wildlife Service. I think what sets focus conservation apart and makes them unique is their team is comprised of almost exclusively former investigators and well-renowned and highly recognized investigators, not only from the United States, but also from the UK. I mean, there are currently, WIM has put together a team that is comprised of former agents, officers, and investigators from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency. We have officers from the UK, from their National Crime Agency, their Defense Intelligence Agency, the Metro Police, the National Criminal Intelligence Service. So there's a myriad of experiences, and I think we have collectively about 500 years of law enforcement, international law enforcement experience on our team. And so that really impressed me to the point where after I retired in December of 2020, I was approached by WIM and asked to consider joining and helping this group there at Focus Conservation. And that sort of led me to Focus was the fact that I was going to be working with people like myself who sort of been in the trenches and have done this work. And I think that really separates Focus from many, if not most or all of the other NGOs, because we have the ability to rely on our experiences. When I was running the unit, I'd often get contacted by an NGO or an organization wanting to pass on intelligence or information or asking me to investigate a certain group or individual. And in some cases, I had some real concerns about how did they get the evidence? What did they do to get the evidence? Was it legal? Will I ever be able to use this in a court? Things are done considerably different here in our U.S. courts. And so, how evidence is obtained and collected and held in a country may not be useful in a U.S. prosecution. And so I always had some hesitancies to work with some groups just because I wasn't always sure about the evidence. And, there are groups that they'll do the investigation themselves. And I don't know what their authority they're working under, but they'll do these investigations and then hand it off to a local law enforcement agency, and they'll run in and make the arrest or whatever. And that might be fine and legal where it's at, but that wasn't the way I was used to operating. And so, again, that's sort of why I migrated towards the Focus Conservation Organization as opposed to maybe some of the others. And now I'm on that side of the fence where I was a little hesitant to work with them. Now I'm sort of advocating because I see the importance of the work that nonprofits and NGOs are doing in this conservation arena, particularly as it relates to trafficking. But I think we can do better by working collaboratively. That is I think we do, and I say that now as a sort of a participant in this conservation world arena in the NGO world, we got to do much better. I think everybody wants to hold on to their own information. They all have the reluctancy to talk, to share, to collaborate. And part of that is derived because, let's face it, when you're a nonprofit or an NGO, I mean, you rely on donors, you rely on funding, you rely on grants. And so I think there's some reluctancies to maybe collaborate or get together with others because in the end, it may end up affecting your ability to get those money and funding from your donors that you so desperately need to survive. And really focused conservation is no different. We operate on grants, on providing funding. And so I think we got to do a better job. There's so many good organizations out there with good intents that are just tripping over each other, chasing the same bad guy, same information. And I think if we worked collectively, I mean, I don't know. I sometimes get disenchanted because I see the same thing. Everybody wants to say the same thing and pat them. Everybody's looking for the photo op and wants to pat themselves on the back and look at me and what we're doing and how great we are. And at the end of the day, it's like, how many years can we keep saying this? When are we going to actually do something about it? I mean, rhinos are still being poached. Elephants are still being slaughtered. Pangolins are still just being decimated. Forests are still being logged. Sharks are still being captured in nets. I mean, when are we going to actually do something instead of just talking about it? I mean, and putting our picture on a website and patting ourselves on the back on the social media blog. So that is sort of kind of how I think. And so my role with Focus is sort of to help them. They have a mission. And the mission of Focus is pretty simple. I mean, it's sort of maybe a little bit of a cliche. You probably have heard it before, but I really think they can take some steps to accomplish this mission. Their mission is to dismantle the illicit wildlife trafficking and support in-country and international enforcement agencies with investigating, arresting, and prosecuting traffickers. A lot of times these other groups, organizations might help with investigating or maybe lead to an arrest. But I think we're trying to do all three of those facets, because I think really where we fall short, and I think we as NGOs fall short, is the prosecution phase. A lot of these, and I found that even when I worked for Fish and Wildlife, you make the big pinch, you get the bust, and you move on to the next one, and you pay a lot less attention to the outcome. And so it always sort of bugged me that you put so many man hours and time, effort, and money and so forth into these investigations, and then you'd get some sort of mediocre or sort of minimal prosecution. And so you have to ask yourself, well, could I have done something any different to make that outcome any better? And a lot of times, at least in the United States, sentencing is sort of a lot of the stuff, there's no wiggle room. There's a range, and you can only get minimums, maximums, and you can't really stray outside of those sentencing guidelines. However, we can do a better job of educating the courts, educating the judges. I mean, if you don't talk and educate them on the importance of wildlife and the role that they play in this global effort to protect wildlife, then you really can't complain when you get a minimal sentence. And so I think and we see some progress, but just like everything in the world, things move at a snail's pace, it seems. We see things are certainly better today than they were 30 something years ago when I started, but they're not where I think they should be. But maybe 30 years from now, it'll be a lot further than they are today, But unfortunately, with wildlife, you can't wait 30 years, because 30 years could mean extinction. And so for some species, it's a race against the clock. And so it's really important that we get out there and support these organizations, support what they're doing, and do what we can to educate not only the judges and the courts and the prosecutors, but also the public. What I found, I've been actively involved in this educational campaign throughout my entire career. And when you talk about this stuff, this is easy to sell. I mean, everyone loves wildlife, and no different than me. And growing up in my childhood, I was fascinated by it. And I think when you start talking to people, it's an easy story to sell. It's easy to get support. It's easy to get people behind you. But if they don't know about it, you can't expect them to jump on your bandwagon. And so I think that's kind of where we're at. We need to let people know. And I think the Rhino Man, the film, I mean, that plays such an important role in opening the eyes to the critical role that these rangers play out there on the global stage. Back in, it was the year in 2000, I was tasked, that's 23 years ago. I was tasked they wanted me to create the very first wildlife trafficking curriculum for Africa, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was going to send a small contingent to Africa to do some training for the International Law Enforcement Academy that was opening in Gaborone, Botswana. And so I was picked to be the team leader of that training. And so it had never been done before. And myself, along with a couple other agents, we put together what we felt was a pretty good curriculum. And I traveled to Botswana in the year 2000 and spent a couple weeks there in Gaborone. And that really was my first time I interacted and broke bread and had drinks and told stories and learned about what wildlife officers, wildlife rangers, wildlife investigators in Africa, what they were doing and the issues they faced. And I came away from that inspired. And I was inspired because when you start sitting down with these African rangers, you can't help but just be so impressed by them. I found myself doing some, self-reflection because, I was doing pretty well. I had everything I needed. I had a lot of training. I had all the equipment. My agency was sending me over to Africa to talk and to train and to share my experience and tell war stories. And I was happy to do that. But when you start sitting down and seeing the eyes of these men and women who were working on the front lines there in Africa, I was in awe. And to me, I was there. I got more out of it probably than they got out of it from me, because it inspired me and it made me appreciate not only what I had going on in the United States, but they were I came away from that and I told people, I said, what's so inspiring is that, these people have so much less than we do as far as support, equipment, training, but they do it anyway. And they risk their lives for very little money, very little appreciation, very little equipment, notoriety. They do it for all the same reasons I do, but because they care about the wildlife and they care about their countries and the beauty that surrounds it. And so I was really inspired by them. And so I left there in 2000. And the other thing I came away from there, and I've done a lot of training throughout the world, and I sort of, at the end of each training, I usually say a few words to the participants. And one of my common themes is, one of the things I found now that I've traveled, whether it's Africa or Southeast Asia or Europe, wherever I've been, one thing is for sure, we're all the same. It's it doesn't matter what color skin you have, or the language you speak, or how much money or equipment or things you have. What I found is the ranger in the Chitwan National Park in Nepal cares about his wife and kids and cares about animals and has all the same problems and all the same issues that I do back here in the country, in the United States. And we're no different. We may live in a different place and speak a different language, but we really have the same passion and desire. And that's really inspiring. And that's what's inspiring about these officers throughout the globe. And I think, getting back to RHINO Man, I think what you're doing is you're highlighting those guys that never get the attention nor the credit that I believe they so well deserve. And from 2000 now all the way until present time, I've been heavily involved in providing international training to literally, hundreds and hundreds of wildlife officers from around the globe. And I get inspired every time I do it, because it just kind of reminds me of why I do what I do. And I guess everybody, without getting too philosophical, but I think everybody, figures out why they were put on Earth and what they were supposed to do, And I think for me, it was, I've always had a fascination with animals and with wildlife. There's a story I was told that, when I was really small, growing up, I grew up in a small farming community in the Midwest, came from meager means, didn't have much. And so spent a lot of time together as a family. But my dad had an affinity for the outdoors. I mean, he lived and breathed the outdoors and the woods. And so the story goes that before I could even walk, apparently my mom cut off a pair of my dad's jeans and created a backpack where my dad could throw me in his homemade backpack and put me on his back and take me out in the woods with him when he was out. And so if the story is true, it's no wonder I grew up with a kinship with the outdoors. I have so many vivid memories of me and my dad and my family and brothers out in the woods, and whether it's just getting muddy or chasing frogs or looking for birds or hunting or fishing, all those things. But I grew up with an extreme love and appreciation for wildlife. In fact, I'm old. I'm old. I mean, we didn't have the internet when I was a kid, so I had to learn by reading and I had to learn by experiencing myself. And so I tried to get as much information as I could. And as I said, we didn't have a whole lot, so every time I had an opportunity to either get something from someone that had something to do with animals, whether it was encyclopedias or books, I was reading about animals from little on. And I think I look back and I think probably one of this kind of might sound a little silly, but I think one of the things that had the biggest impact on me was in the 1960s and 70s, the television show Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. It was syndicated, I think, all the way through the 80s. But during those decades, I watched that show religiously. And it was hosted by Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler. And here I was just some kid from a farming town in the middle of nowhere, USA. Never, ever, ever thought in my wildest dreams that I would have an opportunity to travel the world and see animals. And so I lived through, Marlon Perkins and Jim Fowler as they were running around the world on these, expeditions, and they were bringing these animals into my living room once a week, and I just was wow.
Yeah, I think I remember that show as well. Did you watch Marty Stauffer's Wild America?
I did.
I think that started a little bit later, probably.
That was later, yeah. But that had such an impact. It was like, man, that is what I want to do. I know more than likely being a kid where I was and the situation we were in, it didn't seem like more than a dream that I would get that chance one day. But, going back to my parents, even though they didn't have much, they did whatever they could to make sure that me and my brothers could go to college and pursue our dreams. And so I picked up and decided I was going to study wildlife ecology. I mean, that was just a natural thing for me to do. And I went out of state, so it wasn't cheap. And they borrowed the money and did whatever they could to help me do that. And so without them taking a chance on me and doing that, I certainly wouldn't be where I am today. But things fall into place and things happen for a reason. And I'm a firm believer that through life you have a series of choices. It's a T-road intersection, and you can choose to go left or right, and depending on which direction you choose, really kind of dictates what happens next. And not always it's the right road you want to travel down, and you have to learn from those experiences as well. But for me, I've sort of put myself in. I've had opportunities, and I've been able to take advantage of those opportunities, and that led me to where I am today. Right out of college, I got hired by the Fish and Wildlife Service, and I took a job where it was extremely low paying. It was in Boston, Massachusetts, and everyone I told that I was going to do this was like, "You're crazy. You'll never survive, not on that salary." And so I did it anyway. And me and my wife lived there for almost 3 years, and we did it. We survived. We were probably closer than we would have been had we not been in those circumstances, and it all worked out. And that was my foot into the door of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And after developing a pretty good reputation within the agency, I've kind of moved through the chain and through the process, and I had a pretty successful and illustrious career with the Fish and Wildlife Service. But anyway, getting back, just the whole, the way it evolved for me, and here I am. I mean, this recent January, I was in Nepal. I think we taught about 40 officers from Nepal, teaching about wildlife trafficking issues and so forth. And I'm walking around, traversing through the Chitwan National Park, and I see a one-horned rhinos. I saw 3 mothers and 3 babies, I think, on that particular trip. And it's just, you reflect on that and you're like, man, I've been lucky. I've been lucky to be able to fulfill a dream that sitting in the middle of nowhere I thought would never happen. And so for me, it's sort of paying it forward as I like, and that's one of the reasons I like working now with focused conservation. I like training. I like talking to, I have a lot of over the years, I've talked to a lot of prospective students for advice and college choices and all those sorts of things, and I think it's just a way of paying it forward and trying to help the next generation behind me who can hopefully pick up and do some of the things that we've been able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I feel like you've kind of touched on about 30 or 40 different things that I'm interested in as you were talking. So I'll probably bounce around a little bit, but, kind of going back to the beginning of this part of the conversation where you're talking about what focused conservation is focusing on, maybe you can kind of, especially in terms of, we're talking about NGOs and everyone kind of battling over support and trying to tell their story. I mean, I think you guys are in such a unique position to have major impact by breaking up some of these syndicates, as well as just training and upskilling a lot of these other, whether they're law enforcement services or NGOs that need that training so they could build proper cases. But, what makes you guys unique as an NGO compared to maybe your work when you were with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or WIM with the DEA? What's special about being an NGO with having people from all these different backgrounds and how you're able to navigate and work together and maybe pull on different strings to bring the right people to bear?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I think sets focused conservation apart from the others, besides what I've already mentioned, that we're basically comprised of nothing but former law enforcement investigators that have done it. I mean, with over 500 years of experience. But I think the advantages of this particular organization is not only do we have the expertise and the experience, but now that we're not necessarily hamstrung, tied to the bureaucracy of the agencies we used to work with. And so we have a little more flexibility and freedom to interact and collaborate and work closely with law enforcement partners, government agencies, and other NGOs in this sort of effort to address wildlife trafficking. I mean, there's 4 pillars that I think focused conservation sort of operates under. And one is, we want to lead and coordinate investigations where we penetrate these transnational criminal organizations. And for example, when they assisted with the Moaza Chroma Syndicate, that's what I'm talking about. We sort of assist in the background or in the shadows. We sort of assist by giving information, intelligence, advice, guidance, whatever the case may be, to these large, complex criminal organizations or investigations. And so that's one of the pillars. I think one of the things that I wasn't totally unaware of, and I think is probably unique to, and not being done, I don't know, by anybody else, is focused conservation helps develop and enhance the capabilities in country by helping them create these wildlife crime units. And so what I say is we get together with an agency, we come into a cooperative agreement, and whereby we assign a technical advisor to a task force. And so we're there basically rubbing shoulders with officers from within country. And they may be from one or more agencies from within the country, but they comprise what we call Wildlife Crime Task Force. And by having us be a part of that, we don't necessarily have the quote, the law enforcement authority, but we can be there as a mentor and provide a guidance on how to do some of these cases, based on what we would have done. What if we were running that case, what would we have done? And again, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. A lot of these officers have the same desires and passions. They just don't have maybe the same training or same equipment or maybe the same knowledge about how to do some of these things. And so once we were working with them, rubbing shoulders with them, helping their investigations along, we're seeing some really significant results. And so I think development of these wildlife crime units is certainly unique among the NGO world. Currently, we have technical advisors. We're involved in 5 countries in Africa, in Uganda, which was our first, it's called the Wildlife Crime Unit there in Uganda. That was the very first one created, I think, in 2017 or 18. And then there's Kenya, the Kenya Wildlife Task Force. We have an investigative liaison assigned in South Africa, and they obviously are intertwined with the South African Police Service, their Hawks unit. We recently put some technical advisors in Nigeria. They call the Special Wildlife Office there in Nigeria. And then the most recent one was in Liberia, the Liberia Special Wildlife Unit. And by having these technical advisors there within country, we're able to just sort of help them move these cases along. And so we're there more or less as an advisory role, a mentoring role, providing technical assistance. And so that's sort of the second pillar, our core of what we do.
So I have a question kind of related to that one. How are you getting connected to these government organizations or these law enforcement agencies? I mean, is that a process of where you're reaching out, or is it their teams trying to tackle some of these cases and looking for help? I'm just kind of curious how those relationships build over time.
Yeah, great question. I think it's probably a combination of all the above. The beauty of having officers or experts from Focus Conservation, many of them have been stationed in Africa and throughout the globe in the international arena and have worked with some of these countries, some of these law enforcement agencies. So they have prior contacts, prior relationships, and many of those have been maintained. And for example, for Wim's spent 3 years in Kenya and was an extremely successful DEA agent who had some pretty well-known successes with the DEA. And so his interaction there in Africa, obviously he bumped into and rubbed shoulders and became friends with officers from a variety of countries there in Africa. And I would say the same for most of the people that are working at Focus Conservation now. And so it's a combination of that. And then the other thing is, it's a pretty easy recipe. Once you start having success, people want you to work with them and help them, and they seek you out and those sorts of things. And so success breeds success, And so there's some of that goes on as well as we have some successful operations happening in these countries. And so that's sort of the way it works. And then, a lot of it's based on trust, and developing trust is really critical, particularly in that part of the world. As I mentioned, corruption has its tentacles in so many things there. And so you have to figure out who you can trust, who you can work with. Not only are we talking about the potential threat to wildlife, but we're also talking about threat to the safety of the officers involved, and being outed during an investigation like corruption is something that we obviously want to avoid. And so it's a process. You have to develop a relationship, rapport, trust, and then at some point you develop an agreement between agencies and our governments, and nail out the things that you can and can't do, and that's kind of how that process works.
Have you guys worked at all with any ranger units or kind of anyone in that arena? Just because, as I've learned more over the years working on this project, it does seem like, most of my connections more with South Africa and a lot of it around the rhino poaching. But because of the rise in that type of organized crime, a lot of these rangers have kind of been thrust into, from more of a conservation role to a law enforcement role with, some pretty challenging aspects to it. And so similar to what you're saying, I think in the early days, a lot of them didn't really know how to build a case. And because of that, when it went to prosecution, a lot of these poachers would just get off, they'd be right back in the park the next week. So speaking with General Justa, who was running Kruger for a while and in charge of a lot of those rangers, I remember him talking about a big part of that was making sure to kind of educate his team in how to build cases, collect evidence, things like that, so that they can actually prosecute these guys and put them in jail or stop, make it more risky to come into the park and actually try to do this. So yeah, just curious if you guys focus on that at all, or if that's part of the overall strategy.
Yeah, we certainly do. I mean, we work a lot with rangers. Obviously there are rangers that are assigned as team members on these various task forces, so we interact in that way. But when an operation is going down, and we've had some dangerous scenarios play out where we needed assistance from local law enforcement, other rangers, and so forth, to provide safety, security, backup for either execution of warrants or those sorts of things. So yeah, we interact with them from a standpoint of integrating them at the appropriate times into our operations, particularly when they're being taken down. But that sort of leads to the third core of what Focus does, and that is we try to provide training to not only the wildlife rangers that are assigned to our task force, but we also provide training to various ranger groups, whether they be, for example, when Anton was killed, we went to his ranger unit and provided hostile awareness training, what we call heat training, to the rangers there in his unit to make them, more cognizant of the dangers that are out there, not necessarily what they face day to day, but also, as you may have mentioned, when they're kind of off duty or letting their guard down, and the things that can still happen. And so we have a training we call heat training. We provide that now. We provided that to a variety of different ranger groups throughout Africa, but our training is fairly expansive. It gives us an opportunity to work with other ranger groups. For example, I think recently we were involved with the Mara Elephant Ranger Group, where they just graduated recently a group of rangers, and we had took part in a small role there during that training as it related to one thing you don't think about, and probably people don't think about, but apparently in that particular region, the river there floods very consistently, and there's always this impact of flooding into the local community. And so we provided some search and rescue safety kind of training as it relates to water rescues and those sorts of things, so that those rangers, if they were called to participate in a rescue of a local village or whatever it may be while they're on patrol, they had some expertise and training in that. And so we provided that kind of training. But we have a laundry list of training. And I think one of the things that I think we have that kind of stands out as well is we put on what we call the DEES program. That's a Digital Evidence Exploitation Specialist program. And, we have 3 U.S. technical experts. I mean, these guys they led, in fact, one of them was the director or head of he was my counterpart with Fish and Wildlife Service, and he ran our technical unit, our digital evidence unit for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And he retired about the same time I did. And so he also works for Focus Conservation. And his expertise and knowledge base is related to digital evidence exploitation. And he's brought on a couple of other experts from other U.S. agencies that worked decades on exploiting technical evidence. In today's world, with the advent of iPhones and iPads and computers and laptops and Blackberries and all this stuff, hard drives, it's a treasure trove of evidence and information that's just sitting there. And unfortunately, without proper training or knowledge, sometimes the officers aren't aware or don't know how to get into that, get that evidence that's so critical or important to these investigations. And so we put on a very robust and extensive digital evidence exploitation training course. And we do that not only in Africa, we currently are doing that in South America, Central and South America as well. But that is another part of our training program that's being put on. So, as I mentioned, we do investigations. We're involved in wildlife crime units. We're providing training. And then the last sort of core that Focus is promoting is intelligence and information sharing. One of the members of Focus Conservation is a senior analyst of intelligence. And basically we have a joint agreement with the United for Wildlife organization, part of the Prince William's Royal Foundation. Prince William put together this organization called the United for Wildlife, and obviously and I became involved with United for Wildlife when I was working the Chroma investigation, and they played a role in providing us with some assistance during that investigation. But anyway, Focus Conservation is connected to United for Wildlife, providing intelligence reports, information sheets, alert bulletins, and so we put that. So that's sort of our fourth pillar is intelligence and information sharing, and that's one of the ways we're doing it. So
that's actually how we originally got connected, was through the United for Wildlife Network. We were invited to the Global Summit last year to speak on what happened to Anton and the work of the Rangers because of Prince William's connection to Anton through conversation they had. And that's where I think I met Wim, and Tim Wittig was there at the time. And you guys, the whole team was just super supportive and helping with that whole situation, like you mentioned, with the heat training as well. And just from my side and the interactions I've had with you guys, the whole team that I've met so far, Wim, I think I've met Eric, Ronnie, I've talked to a couple times via Zoom, Patricia I've met a couple times. And it's an incredible group of people with amazing backgrounds and experience coming together to do some massive good in the world. So just it's kind of an honor to be able to know you guys and to share some of this story on the focused conservation side. So yeah, just wanted to say that formally.
Yeah, and I know that, things that happened to Anton, the dangers are real. I've done this for, 30 plus years, and there have been scenarios that were fairly dangerous. There have been scenarios that were fairly sketchy. Certainly myself and directed towards my family, were threats and those sorts of things, because when you're investigating bad guys, they don't really care. So we want to make sure that these officers, these rangers are well prepared, fully aware, don't let the guard down. And there's some things you just you can't prevent. I remember, I think it was, I met with Chrissy from the PAMS Foundation.
Yeah, I've had Chrissy on here.
The assassination of Wayne Lauder. Wayne was a true conservationist, one of those people that was out there on the forefront trying to raise awareness to the slaughter of elephants. And, he paid the ultimate price for it. He was assassinated in a car there. And the PANS Foundation, we had a connection with them as well during with some of the work we were doing over there in Africa. And, and it's real life. And even though it's wildlife, I think the people, not only the officers, but even the public needs to understand that these people are putting their lives out there for animals, for wildlife. And I think, and many of them are willing to pay the ultimate sacrifice if it came to that. And, that's admirable, obviously, but we want to minimize that. And so we do that through training, awareness, education, and truthfully, if we start improving prosecutions and creating deterrence out there, maybe people would think twice. We have the same problem here in the United States with the killing of police officers. And there's just this attitude where, people don't care and life isn't that valuable anymore. And so we got to try to change that perspective. I'm not sure how we go about it, but that's certainly, we're not immune to that in the wildlife arena. And, the death of Wayne Lauder, the death of Anton, and there's a laundry list, unfortunately, of great conservationists and rangers and officers that have died, have been killed, doing what they love, and what they fought so hard to do. So, yeah, it's real.
Yeah, if you're open to talking about it, how's that experience through your career changed over the years? Do you remember a time as you were kind of getting more and more into the law enforcement side when you realized that, oh, there actually could be a risk to my life, and just kind of thinking through how you process that over time and how that's maybe changed?
Yeah, I've had a lot of, I wouldn't say a lot, but I've had a number of sort of experiences where I was like, oh, wow, that could have went one of a couple ways, And I think that's why you need to be properly trained. You need to have, and law enforcement really isn't for everybody. There's people that think they can do it, and Fish and Wildlife Service was no different. There were people that worked within the agency that had great intentions and wanted to do a good job, but I was afraid that when things hit the fan, they'd be in trouble, because you got to be able to think quick. You got to be able to react. And you got to hope that your training will jump in and take over, But, early, actually, it was very early in my career. One of the very first experiences I had with a weapon. I was out in the middle of a marsh, and I heard some shooting at night. It was obviously not legal shooting hours, and I was hearing some shots. But as I commented earlier, hey, here I am. I'm going to save the world. I got my gun, I got my badge, and I'm bulletproof, right? So I go out there by myself. Nobody knows that I'm out there, at least from my agency, and I'm out there going to figure out who in the heck is shooting, and I'm going to catch them and I'm going to arrest them. And that was sort of my mentality at the time, And when you're young and fresh out of the academy, you think you're bulletproof, So I go marching through the marsh, and I'll never forget. I came upon, I heard the shots, and I was going towards them, and it was dark, and I didn't want to use my flashlight because I didn't want to give away my location, and so I was walking in the dark towards them. And at some point, I could see people, see a flashlight, and I could hear people talking, walking towards me, and so I sort of just kind of stood off the path and waited for them to come up to me, and I was going to obviously jump out and introduce myself and surprise them. And when I did, it was cordial, and obviously they were a little shocked to see me there. And we were going through our pleasantries. And then all of a sudden I heard, put the weapon down. And I was so funneled into the people that were in front of me What I had not seen was there was someone actually behind me that had a gun. But the other thing I didn't was totally unaware of was there was another officer who also heard the same shooting I did and happened to be in the same area. And he was the one directing the other guy to put his weapon down. And so
Oh, wow.
that was one of my very first experiences where I was like, oh, okay, this could have really kind of gone bad if it wasn't for the grace of God. And this other officer happened to hear the same shooting at night that I heard. And so it all turned out fine and everything was okay. But that was sort of eye opening. But since then, I mean, since that time, I had a number of similar experiences, particularly, one of the things I was sort of my niche within the agency is I worked a lot of undercover. I enjoyed that type of work, working undercover, but it didn't come with it, without its challenges. Certainly had some danger involved. Maybe that was part of it, the adrenaline. But I've had a number of situations where you're in the middle of nowhere and they call you out and they think you're a police officer or a cop or a fed or whatever the terminology is, and you have those sort of confrontations, real life confrontations where you have to convince them you're not, because you just need to survive, and so you got to say and do whatever it takes to make them assured that you're not who they think you are. And so you go through that, you prepare for it, but when it happens in real life, you just got to do your best to make sure that you're able to deal with those scenarios. And over the years, I've been heavily involved in training, and we actually had a scenario where we would have an officer pretending, go in an undercover capacity, and I was the bad guy, and we'd be doing our thing, and they'd be the undercover agent would talk to me and try to get me to say the things that we teach them they need to say and all that stuff, and of course I'm just waiting for the opportunity. But then I would, in certain circumstances, I would confront them and get in their face and accuse them of being a cop. And some of them would fold like a wet noodle. I mean, they would fold and I am a cop, and then they wouldn't know how to react. And fortunately, that was done in a training scenario. And so there wasn't a real danger to them. But if that was real life, it could have been dangerous. And so it makes those people realize that maybe this really wasn't my thing. And maybe I'm not going to be very good at undercover work and so forth. So, and it's certainly not for everybody. You got to have the ability to think fast, anticipate questions, have a response already built into your brain, and be believable. It's kind of like acting. It's like being on a screen and acting and making the person believe you're somebody that you're really not. And so I kind of like that. But there were those challenges. I remember I was working in undercover in Alaska, and me and my partner were asked to go and basically go with these two poachers who were sneaking into a national forest to kill brown bears. And so we left with them, and we spent about 10 days, several hours from civilization on a boat in the middle of a bay trying to kill bears. And I remember that because of the daylight and nighttime and daytime was all messed up there for me in Alaska.
Didn't think about that.
It stayed daylight way longer than I was used to. Well, anyway, it was probably, I don't remember, maybe around midnight, and my partner had not come back yet from hunting with his bad guy. I had one, I was with one of the bad guys, he was with the other, and he had not come back to the boat. And I started to panic a little bit because I'm thinking to myself, okay, I'm the senior agent here. Yeah, I'm supposed to be teaching him what to do, but truthfully, nobody knows where we're at. Our phones don't work. We did have a satellite phone for an emergency, but if you can envision, one of the challenges we had was we're on a boat. And so these people had the ability to go through our things. It wasn't like we could just go to a hotel or leave and go home or whatever. So we lived with them for 10 days. And so I was trying to be creative on how to not get caught, how to take notes, how to remember what all happened. And so I actually, I guess it sounds a little silly now, but I kept all my, I took little notes or recordings because I wore a body wire, and I took recordings and I placed them in an athletic cup. And
no one wants to look there, huh?
My crotch, and I thought, well, he's not going to be getting in there, so I'm sure that that information is not going to be found. But that was like the only place that I felt safe that they wouldn't figure out who we were, because when I was off hunting or whatever, it would take nothing for them to rifle through my belongings. And so we couldn't have anything that would give us away.
So did you have to pretend to shoot at bears and miss?
No, I actually, really, I tell people this. I hunted a lot of my life, but I was a very ethical hunter, and we only hunted for food and think, we never wasted. And one of those sort of mantras where, if you're not going to eat it, you're not allowed to kill it, kind of a thing, and so very respectful of that. And so this whole poaching a brown bear in a national forest thing was just internally appalling to me, And so I struggled with that, but I knew for the sake of the case that I had to kill a bear, because no one would go through what we were going through for 10 days and then miss so the opportunity presented itself, and I ended up killing a bear. And part of the case centered around the fact that we had to prove we were killing him on the national forest. And so a little funny story about that is we saw the bear, and he was out on the shoreline, and we took our Zodiac and we parked up the shoreline. And I'm thinking as a cop now, like, okay, I got to make sure I do this, and I got to get all this evidence. And one of the important parts that I needed for this case was to a GPS reading on our location to prove that we were on the national forest. And so I'm fiddling around trying to get my GPS all ready and set up, and the bad guy's like yelling at me, like, "Come on, we gotta go!" And he was getting really angry at me because I was taking so long, and I was, trying to get everything right. Obviously, he was unaware that I was trying to get the proper recordings and all that stuff together. But I eventually met up with him and ended up shooting a very large bear that day, and so did my partner. He didn't come back to the boat past midnight, and I was getting really worried, but ended up he had killed the bear along with his bad guy, and it took them that long to get it back to the boat. So, but anyway, they were prosecuted, and it was successful from that standpoint. We were able to take that poaching operation out of that particular area of Alaska. So those are things that you have to do when you work undercover, and there are dangers involved. And I think the very first undercover case I ever worked, truthfully, by myself. Nobody knew where I was, who I was with, or what I was doing, but it was very low level. And I kind of laugh now because I thought I would, at the time I thought I was, but there was actually an individual that was stealing migratory bird eggs out of the wild, mainly waterfowl. And he would incubate these eggs up, hatch the chicks or ducklings or goslings or whatever they are, and he would sell them. But okay, that's not too hard. I can do that case. And so I started integrating and myself into this guy's world and got introduced. And we decided finally to meet for the first time. And he was going to actually take me out to do some illegal collecting. We were actually going to collect some wild waterfowl, but as you might be aware, they go through a molting period where they lose their flight feathers and unable to fly. And so this bad guy knew that these birds were at a stage where they couldn't get away from us. And so, he's a bad guy. He's like, let's go catch him, and sell him. I'm like, all right. So I agreed to meet him, and I'm sitting, I'll never forget this. I'm thinking I'm Mr. Joe Undercover here, and I'm sitting in a McDonald's parking lot waiting for my bad guy I hadn't seen him up until this time, never met him before. And so I'm sitting there, and I'm watching a guy walking down the sidewalk in not a very real good area of town. And all he's got on is cut off blue jean shorts. And he's got tats all over his body, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm just thinking, well, that guy's a little sketchy. And all of a sudden he turns and starts walking towards my truck, and he jumps in the passenger seat, introduces himself, and he's my bad guy. I'm like, oh crap. Okay.
Wow.
And it was obvious to me based on how he presented himself and the things he said that he was involved in a lot more than just, birds. And so I thought to myself, oh my gosh, nobody knows who I'm with. I don't even know anything about this guy, but it appeared to me that he obviously it seemed like he had prison tats on him. And so I thought this is going to be interesting. So we took off and we actually went out and caught some ducks and geese and the whole thing. And anyway, long story short, eventually, he went to prison, but he went to prison actually for a variety of things, but narcotics and armed robbery and those kind of things. But I also convicted him on stealing these migratory birds. But I just bring up this sort of, you asked about some experiences, and you have a variety of experiences, but each one of those are really kind of learning teaching tools. And that's where like guys like me and the other guys that are working with focused conservation, I mean, we've had those experiences. And so we can go and interact with a ranger in Liberia or Zambia. And when you're sitting down and breaking bread and telling stories, and it sort of reassures them that we know what we're talking about. We've been there. We've had these similar experiences and how we dealt with them. And hopefully that'll translate to the work that they're doing, and maybe make it safer, or maybe make them think of things they wouldn't have thought of down the road. So I've had a lot of experiences like that.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate those stories because I think, when you hear of like the DEA or FBI or something like that, your mind kind of goes to those places of like undercover or breaking up international syndicates and things like that. But I feel like, especially like with US Fish and Wildlife, growing up, I just imagine, oh, they're the guy that comes and like checks and makes sure you got your hunting license or your fishing license, and maybe you'll get a fine if you have too many shells in your shotgun for that season or something like that. But I don't think too many people realize the types of crimes and the depth of crime that's happening in that arena that you have to deal with, and all the way up to I didn't even realize, I think until recently, that there's a whole investigative unit doing these international busts and trying to catch these syndicates that are transnational outside of the U.S. And maybe
that's their special investigations unit.
Yeah,
I started with that unit in 2010. And truthfully, I mentioned earlier about things happen for a reason, and things you look back years later and like I understand it now. I mean, and at the time there was a change in our leadership for the Fish and Wildlife Service. We got a new chief that got brought in. His name was Bill Woody, and in the 2010. He liked to interact and be sort of hands-on and meet with people in the field. And he actually started a sort of a tour around the country to try to meet his people, I guess, for lack of a better term. And I specifically recall he came to Chicago because I used to supervise in the Midwest. I ran multiple offices in Illinois, Indiana, Missouri. And so I put together a meeting in Chicago because the chief was coming and I wanted him to meet everybody and so forth. And after that meeting, me and him got together for a personal conversation. And he told me that he had studied up a little bit about me, heard a lot about the work that I was doing, was impressed with my reputation, and wanted to know if I'd be willing to take on an investigation, a global investigation into rhino horn trafficking. And I admittedly, I knew very little about rhino horn trafficking, but I certainly wasn't about to tell my new chief, no, I won't do it. And so I agreed to do it. And I said, well, yeah, I'll do it. I guess I got a little brave because I did make a couple of requests. I said, well, I would like to have my own team, be able to pick the people that work with me. And I really would like the freedom to do whatever we got to do to catch the bad guys. And again, I was always sort of had a reputation of thinking out of the box and being more cutting edge and not going with the flow. And so I had some ideas in my head how I would like to move forward with this new rhino horn trafficking investigation. And so he agreed to all those terms, I guess, for lack of a better term. And so, I went home and thinking to myself, okay, I gotta do this rhino horn case, but I gotta start trying to build a case. And then that's really when I heard start looking into it. And the more I looked into it, the more intelligence. Keep in mind, this is 2010, and it sort of coincided with the uptick of rhinos being poached particularly in South Africa at the time. I think in the early 2000s, I think in 2007, there may have been like 13 rhinos poached. But in 2010, I believe that number jumped to almost 300 or more or something like that. And so I started looking into intelligence and trying to develop this investigation now that I've been tasked with rhino horn trafficking. And I came across a case in 2010 that had been done a couple months earlier in Colorado, a case called Operation Power. And it was an undercover case done by Fish and Wildlife Service. It was actually done by a friend of mine, a very close buddy of mine, an agent in Colorado. And at that time, he ended up arresting two individuals from Ireland. And these two individuals were from now what we know is an organized criminal syndicate known as the Rathkill Rovers or the Irish Travelers. And what's so significant, as we know today, that we didn't know back in 2010, was the Travelers were an organized crime family there out of Rathkill, Ireland, were basically responsible for all the museum thefts of rhino horns in Europe. There were over 100 rhino horns stolen from museums throughout Europe.
Was that all around that same time that those were being stolen?
It all started in around 2010 and on. But we didn't know. So what happened was this group, the syndicate group, they start sending out their soldiers or whatever the term is. They sent out these people to various countries to start searching for rhino horn. They caught on the fact that rhino was starting to become very lucrative in Southeast Asia, in particular, Vietnam and China and Hong Kong and a couple other places. And so the thing about that, they thought, well, heck, this is easy money. We'll just steal them out of the museums in Europe, and we're going to go to these other countries and try to find them. And so they sent scouts or whatever to the United States. And what they had done was they put an ad in a taxidermy website soliciting rhino horns. And one thing led to another. They got introduced to an undercover agent from Fish and Wildlife, ended up buying some horns from our undercover agent, got arrested and got sentenced to prison. We thought, okay, great, that's a good case. We did it, but we had no idea about the magnitude of this organization or what was about to happen in the years to come after 2010. And so I started collecting that information, and then word got out. I started putting word out that I was looking for information on rhino horns, and then again, it's kind of a cool little story. But in January of 2011, I got a call from an agent on the East Coast. And then basically, and I'll tell you the funny part about this story is I would routinely give platelets for cancer patients. And it's a 4-hour procedure, and they take the blood out of you and you lay there for 4 hours, and they strip your blood of platelets, and then they put the blood back in you and whatever. And I would do this on a monthly, not a monthly, but a fairly regular basis, because the platelets are so critical and important to cancer patients. And so, I just one of the things I did. And I remember I was laying there giving platelets on the gurney with needles in both arms, and my cell phone rang. And I don't remember how I was able to get the phone, but I was able to get the call answered, and it was this agent off the East Coast. And he's like, "Hey, I understand you're heading up this rhino horn trafficking investigation." He's like, "I got some information from you that I wanted to share." And I'm like, "Okay." And he says, "I got contacted by Europol with some intelligence that there are 2 Irish subjects traveling to the United States with the goal of soliciting rhino horn." And it's one of those things where you're like, okay, how, and over the years, I've gotten so many calls that didn't pan out, or the information wasn't accurate or whatever. So you're always a little bit like, okay. So he gave me some pretty detailed information, who they were, and they were coming into St. Louis, Missouri, and landing later that day. It was that day. And so he just wanted to pass that information to me. And I'm thinking to myself, well, shoot, I'm laying here giving platelets. I'm 3 hours away from St. Louis. How am I going to pull this off? And so I called a couple of my agents from Missouri, and I said, look, we got to pull this off somehow. I need you to get to the airport, organize a surveillance. These are the guys, and provided all that information and intelligence. And so I said, I'm laying here giving platelets. As soon as I'm done, I'll be on my way. So they got their stuff together. I gave platelets. I got done, threw a bag in my car, and I drove a couple hours down to St. Louis to hopefully take part in this surveillance. And so, and what I had learned upon arrival is that the 2 subjects did actually come in as identified, and we were able to put eyes on them, and we followed them to a rental car place. And so that was about the time that I had picked them up, was at a rental car place. And so we had anybody that's done surveillance in their careers, there's a heck of a lot more that fail than succeed. At least that's always sort of been my take. And so you never know how these things are going to go, but you try your best, So we knew it was going to be a multi-days. We had no idea where they were going. We didn't know what was going to happen, but long story short is we ended up doing a surveillance on them, and they took off from St. Louis, and they started driving towards a part of Missouri that made absolutely no sense whatsoever. And I remember vividly that it was a huge snowstorm, and you could barely see. And as it turns out, these members of the Irish travelers, they were fairly sophisticated and trained in counter-surveillance. And they would run these counter-surveillance maneuvers on us, trying to see if they were being followed. And so they would just do these little crazy things to see. And so thankfully, we were able to anticipate a lot of these moves. and did not get detected. But the weather got so bad that they ended up pulling off into a hotel. And so we had to sit there in the parking lot and basically wait for them to regroup in the morning and then resume our surveillance. And so that's what we did. And we ended up following them to what turned out to be a live animal auction place in Macon, Missouri. And it's sort of like the Hollywood movie, you know, the garage door goes open, they travel in, the garage door goes down, and now we're like, okay, there's no, we can't just walk in there. So we just basically had to sit and wait and watch, and we did. And at some point, the door comes open and they come out, and we can resume our surveillance. And they started going down this highway that made not a lot of sense. It was like a 2-lane highway, and I was like, And so we backed off and didn't follow them. We let them go. And as it turned out, they were doing the same thing, doing counter surveillance, because they went a distance, sat on the road for a while, and then turned around and came back. And then they went back to the place they went. Garage door goes open, they come in, garage door closes, and they resume whatever activities they were in that night or that day. Then they left and returned back to St. Louis. And this is really the critical point of a major investigation that you may have heard about that I initiated and oversaw, called Operation Crash. And this is sort of the key. I think maybe, I look back now, and maybe without this moment, we may not have had Operation Crash. And without Operation Crash, I don't think we would have had a lot of the other things that we have. But we followed them to St. Louis, and I followed them to a bank there in St. Louis. And so now, if you're thinking like a cop, we've identified them. We've identified a place they've been to. Now we identified a financial institution that they are associated with. And so we did our surveillance within the bank and watched them interact and do the things. And during that interaction, I was able to learn that they had been doing some business with a Chinese national living in New York City who ran a particular business called Quality Work Group. And so it meant nothing to me at the time, but that was just another sort of fact that I was putting in my head. And so after they left the bank, they got returned to the airport. We actually jumped on the plane with them and flew to New York City with them and resumed surveillance in New York City. And so now we knew that there was a connection between Missouri, this bank, New York City, so forth and so on. But that fact that I was able to get the Quality Work Group turned out to be pivotal in this investigation, only from the standpoint that we started looking into that company, looking at who owned that company. And I learned that individual owner of that company was traveling from JFK to China. And so we made contact with him at the airport and ended up doing a search of his luggage. And lo and behold, he was smuggling a RHINO libation cup and some elephant ivory that he was bringing from New York to China. And so we arrested him there at the airport. And that was the genesis of Operation Crash. When we arrested him, like all good investigations, we didn't just stop there. We executed, a search warrant on his residence and developed a bunch of intelligence, information, and evidence that this particular individual was involved in rhino horn trafficking. So now we knew that the Irish travelers were now connected to a Chinese individual, our national out of New York City. And what we had also learned was prior to that, and unbeknownst to us, these same Irish travelers sold this Quality Work Group 4 rhino horns that originated out of Texas. And that sort of illustrates how this rhino horn trade worked back in that time frame. And again, this was a 2011 time frame. But the 4 Irish individuals went to Texas looking for horns, similar to what they did in Missouri and St. Louis, Missouri. And they located some horns, but the guy wouldn't sell them to them. So they actually paid a homeless guy to buy these horns on their behalf and gave him a little bit of a kickback. And so they bought these horns for $28,000. And they took those horns to New York City. They were 4 black rhino horns.
Were they carved horns, or was it just raw horn?
Just raw horns. And they took them to New York City, and they met with Quality Work Group, and they sold those $28,000 horns to the Quality Work Group for $50,000. Well, the Quality Work Group turned around and sold them to an antiques dealer who was from Taiwan. Quality Work Group sold them to an antiques dealer for $80,000. That antiques dealer sold them to a smuggler from Taiwan for $108,000. That smuggler from Taiwan brought them to China, and we don't know how much he sold them for, but I can assume is more than $108,000. So it sort of really illustrated to us the value of these horns and what was happening in the trade. Everybody was making something on these $28,000 horns. All of a sudden, were being sold for $108,000, and so that was a $100,000 markup in a matter of weeks. And so that sort of raised some flags, like this is a pretty lucrative business, and we better be looking into this stuff. And so, as I mentioned, we started executing a bunch of search warrants and so forth, and one thing led to another. And at the end of the day, Operation Crash was a huge success. I mean, fortunately, I was able to put my team together as I requested from the chief. I put some of the best and the brightest agents from Fish and Wildlife Service on the Operation Crash team. And man, we just went gangbusters, and we started really working a lot of cases. And I think we opened over 40 separate investigations. I think we identified approximately 1,000 potential subjects. We wrote over 1,300 case reports. We executed over 50 search and arrest warrants.
What was the time span?
This is in a couple of years, about like 18 months, a couple of years kind of a thing. Sort of one of the things that, getting back to that place in Missouri, obviously, our eyes were now on that place. And so we had to figure out, why were these Irish guys hanging around in Missouri? Didn't make any sense. And came to realize that place in Missouri was a major hub for rhino horns. And not only going to the Irish, but horns coming out of Missouri going to some Vietnamese individuals out of Little Saigon, outside of Los Angeles, California. A father and son there owned a porcelain company called Win Lee Corporation. And looking into it and doing what we do, I was able to document and determine that there were at least minimum of 18, I think, shipments of rhino horns from Missouri to California. And then once they got to California, they were integrated into shipments and then smuggled out of the country to Vietnam. And so we started working not only the place in Missouri undercover, but we started working undercover in California. And the place in California, what we've learned was the place in Missouri was being frequented by people involved in mainly, you would think of the agricultural industry, because they were selling cattle, but they also, on certain days, had an exotic animal sale. So it kind of brought that element, those kind of people, to their auction house from time to time. And so what happened was the Vietnamese duo from California had visited this place in Missouri and wanted some horns. And so the place in Missouri they put them in touch with an individual who was on the pro rodeo circuit. And because he traveled the country and had access to, people, he sort of was the liaison between Missouri and California, where he moved horns, not only between Missouri, helped move them, but he also then sort of cut the Missouri people out and started moving his own as well. So we started following him. And where I was going with this is we've been working this, really, we had undercover things going on all over the country, so many different facets and different levels, from low levels to high major syndicate leaders kind of thing. But the rodeo guy, I had gotten a call from an anonymous caller who wanted to tell me that this person was aware that my rodeo guy was currently in California and was there to pick up approximately $330,000 in cash from the Vietnamese, and was bringing that money back to his home. And so I struggled with that information. Like, okay, if it's true, what are we going to do? Because if we contact him and flip the badge, and from that point, the undercover case is done. So I had to weigh both of those options, and now I struggled with that. And I finally said, okay, we're gonna do it. We're gonna check him at the airport and see if he's got what they say he's got. And I'll be darned, he had about $330,000 in cash. It was him and his wife and his mother, and they had it hidden in different compartments within their suitcases. Had it in their baby stroller and those kind of areas. Of course, they came up with some concocted a story as to why they were carrying that much cash. But nonetheless, the cash was seized. But that sort of put everything in fast motion, like, okay, we got to roll now. And so from that day, it took us 7 more days to put a plan together to take the Operation Crash case down. And we took it down across the United States. I had probably over 100 officers involved. We executed search and arrest warrants in multiple states. In California, the father-son duel from Win Lee, I think we seized over $1 million in cash and gold. We seized rhino horns. And we seized cars and jewelry and gold bars. And it was huge. It was a huge success. But that case, and I kind of look back sometimes thinking, well, I'm laying there giving platelets. If I could have easily just said, you know what, I don't got time to deal with this today.
Yeah, nobody has excuses for donating platelets if you're able to start an entire operation on the same day.
I made that decision. It all worked out, and so this case just it happened. We were and then it just didn't stop because, when you do these big cases, when you start interacting with people and everybody, people want to talk and people want to flip and people want to cooperate and one thing leads to the next. And so that's more search warrants and more interviews and more evidence. And it just kept moving on and on and on. And so we had to funnel our attention onto the core and say, we can't grab everybody. We just got to take the core. So there were a lot of people that deserved to get pinched, but probably didn't.
Just try to have the highest impact with the resources you have.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm most proud of is the awareness that case brought to the issue of wildlife trafficking. I mean, back when I started that case in 2011, 12 timeframe, that terminology wasn't really ever, you didn't hear those words it was very rare that you heard those words. And so it brought that globally, they became aware of trafficking. And then, it catapulted into, oh my gosh, so many positives. I mean, if you think about it, President Obama at the time, we were giving briefings to his staff and the White House on the work that we were doing. And it wasn't long. In fact, it was later, only months later after the takedown in March, or the takedown, that he created the executive order. I think it was created, I believe, in July. I mean, we took it down in, I think it was June. And he created the executive order on combating wildlife trafficking. And what that did, what it sort of brought world attention and even U.S. attention to the issue of wildlife trafficking. We knew what was going on, but we were like the only ones and no one had seemed to care. Now we had the president who seemed to care. He created the Presidential Wildlife Task Force. And then, of course, politics being what they are, Congress and senators and political appointees, everybody started having a real interest in the issue because it was Operation Crash was consistently in the paper, was consistently in the media. I was getting, overwhelmed with requests. And so it was out there and people were interested and so were they. And so what ended up happening was the ambassadors. There were ambassadors that said, hey, Fish and Wildlife, we want your agents to work at our embassy. And so that was sort of the launching of the attaché program for Fish and Wildlife, where we would actually be putting special agents in various embassies throughout the world to integrate and collaborate with our partners there in those various countries, which has resulted in cases like Moaza Chroma. There would have been a Moaza Chroma likely had we not had an attaché in Tanzania. And so these things all sort of are feeding off themselves. But, then when, during that time, if you may be aware, we did 2 ivory crushes. We did a big ivory crush in Denver, Colorado. We did an ivory crush in Times Square, New York City, where we brought in, the press and the media and some celebrities, and we brought in all the ivory and we crushed it, took part in burning of $1 million worth of rhino horns at the San Diego Wild Animal Park in San Diego that same year, where we wanted to raise global attention to the issue of wildlife trafficking and poaching of rhinos. And so we did that at the San Diego Zoo and Animal Park. And then, President Trump, when he came in the office, he sort of piggybacked onto what was being done. And, he also put out an executive order. And what was important about what President Trump did was he added wildlife trafficking as to the list of priorities for federal agencies to investigate transnational criminal organizations. So now narcotics and all those things and wildlife trafficking is specifically identified by the President of the United States. And so it really elevated the attention and the awareness to wildlife trafficking and really catapulted this interest and desire to work internationally. Now the work the Fish and Wildlife Service was doing was global. It was no longer, local or regional or national. It was global. And I think what we did in Operation Crash was particularly because we were able to grab people from other countries who were trying to hide out in other countries and extradite them back to the United States. We had numerous extraditions back to the United States. And so no longer could the bad guy hide in a foreign country and feel like they were not going to get in trouble. And so as that went forward, that segued into to me participating in the work that we did with the Special Investigation Unit, Waza Chroma, and many others that have been and are currently still being worked by the unit. There's some really good cases being worked right now that haven't received the attention yet because they're not known yet, but they will be at some point. And so,
that was something I wanted to ask you. How do you, as an investigator, find I guess maybe the patience is the right word, and maybe this is just natural for good investigators, but some of these cases take years to really have the real results and impact that you're hoping to have. And in the meantime, all of these crimes are being perpetrated leading up to the actual big busts towards the end. So how do you weigh that, I guess, internally as you're processing these?
Well, it's tough. Obviously we live in a world with instant gratification. Everybody wants everything now and quick. That doesn't work. And I think that probably leads to why, some cases get pled out to minimal, sentences and those sorts of things because things just take so long. It's just, you have to I really got to give credit to the prosecutors we worked with throughout not only my career, but in particular those that worked with us on Crash and the Waza Chroma case, because you got to have good prosecutors. But when you're working with good prosecutors, you start having a clear understanding of what you need to get a conviction. If your goal here is to take the bad guy off the street and put him in jail or prison, you got to check all the boxes. There's no shortcuts, because if you take a shortcut, you're going to lose your case. And so all of your efforts would be for naught. And so, yeah, they take long. And a lot of times they take long because, what people don't understand is when laws are written, many times the statutes have various things in them that are required for conviction. For example, there are certain laws that require knowledge. People say, well, he had a rhino horn, he should go to prison for 10 years. Well, maybe the law says he has to know it's a rhino horn, and he has to know it's endangered. He has to know that what he was doing was illegal. Well, if you just walk up to him and say, you're under arrest for having a rhino horn, you may not convict him if the law is written that way. And so a lot of times the general public doesn't understand that there's these other nuances that are built into these statutes. And so that's why these things take a long time, because maybe we still don't have him saying those magic words that we need to have him say on, when we're in an undercover capacity. So a lot of times these things seem like they take forever.
Or I guess, like you were saying, you might be trying to get the bigger group or person or entity to take them down because it's going to have a bigger impact. And if you just catch that one small guy, then they're still out there and they're...
Exactly. Yeah. The way you'd want to work a case like this is you'd want to work from the bottom up. And so, you try to flip someone at a lower level against the next level. You just keep working yourself up the pyramid with the goal in mind of trying to get, one of the main characters. And so that's the goal. And sometimes it takes a while. It takes a while of negotiating and collaborating and convincing, because look, if I had $1 for every bad guy that tried to tell me he was innocent and didn't think he did anything wrong, then I probably could have retired, 10 years earlier. But once you throw out on the table what you got and say, okay, buddy, here's the tape, here's the photo, here's what you said, blah, blah, blah. That's when they have a realization like, okay, I need to figure out how I can get myself out of this bad situation. And that's how you can convince them to maybe cooperate with you and help you move up that pyramid. But you're absolutely right. That also plays into some of the strategies of these prosecutions. And that's why sometimes people might get a lesser sentence, and you're like,
yeah,
wow, that guy got nothing. Well,
he might have helped you get someone bigger.
Maybe he helped us get the guy way, way up at top, and it was worth the trade-off.
Just out of curiosity, if you're able to say so, you mentioned this little hub in Missouri for the Operation Crash. Where was that horn coming from that was getting there that then was being transported around? What was that part of the operation?
Well, one of the things that, we really didn't pay any attention to up until that point, not to the degree we probably could have maybe, is this was a lot of the horn was already in the country. It was in the country from hunting trophies, old hunting trophies from the 60s and 70s. And if you think about it, some widow, her husband died, and she's hated this thing hanging on her wall for the last 50 years, and he's no longer around. And the first thing I'm going to do is sell that damn thing, and how much can I get for it, Well, unfortunately, or fortunately, I don't know what, but, there's some pretty sketchy and sneaky players that were involved in this rhino horn world. And they would rip these, little old ladies off of their husband's trophies and tell them it wasn't worth much, but I could probably sell it for $1,500. And then, they turn around and sell for $15,000. And, the person that got rid of it didn't get anything. And that happened a lot. So obviously I wasn't interested in the widow who was trying to liquidate her husband's hunting trophy. So a lot of them came from that. I mean, one of the other things that really opened our eyes during Crash that I think gets very little attention is the whole libation cup, RHINO libation cup thing. I was aware of them, but I really had no clue till I started getting involved in Operation Crash, the value of these cups. I mean, these cups, many of them were valued 6 figures or more, and the big major auction houses, all the familiar names that you would think about operating out of California, New York City, and other places. You could, up until we started Operation Crash, you could go online and see libation cups being consistently offered for sale. And so one of the things that this is my opinion, but it's based on pretty much a lot of the experience I had during this case is, a lot of this was being driven by the carving industry. There's an underground carving industry in China and other locations there in Southeast Asia. And I think everyone's knee-jerk reaction is, oh, rhino horn, that's an aphrodisiac, or that's a medicine that can cure cancer, or some crazy thing that you hear. And yeah, there's some validity to that. There's certainly traditional Chinese medicine that has used rhino horn and still to this day continues to use rhino horn. I personally don't believe that the rhino horn trafficking frenzy is purely being pushed by the Chinese traditional medicinal market. I think it's the carving industry. I mean, when you got cups like Ming Dynasty cups that are selling for, $250,000 or more dollars from an auction house in New York City, there's a lot of incentive there to try to make libation cups. Now, if you think about it, if you make a cup, you're going to have remnants, you're going to have pieces and particles, and yeah, that's in my opinion getting pushed off into the medicinal market. But I think it makes no sense in my mind, a beautiful horn from a rhino that's multi kilograms big and beautiful, they're just going to grind it to powder and throw it in a pill. It just doesn't make any sense to me. They're going to carve that thing. I mean, some of the people involved in Operation Crash, we investigated a significant number of individuals that were involved in this libation cup market as well, and including the auctions and the auction houses. One case, we actually consigned a libation cup to a auction, a black rhino, and undercover, and they were advised, they knew it was illegal and the whole thing, and they put the darn thing on the cover of their sale catalog because no one at that time was getting in any trouble for selling rhino horns. Now, we bought it back because it was important for us to show that this auction house was willing to sell it or accept it, knowing it was illegal, and then turn around and sell it to us. And so we ended up not only giving them the rhino horn, but we bought it back. But we worked a lot of these auction houses. And one of the things about the libation cup, and I brought this up a number of times, and it is when you're dealing with these cups or carvings, just carvings in general, how is an officer on the street or on the front line supposed to know if that's from a white rhino or a black rhino or a Sumatran or whatever? You don't. And the fact that, at least in the United States, the Endangered Species Act protected the black rhino and not necessarily the white rhino. Well, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that the bad guys aren't going to figure that out. And sort of halfway through our contacts, and every potential sale was no longer a black rhino object. It was a white rhino, because, I can say. And so we had to do DNA work and all that. And then that's another thing. I mean, you got a libation cup that's worth, $500,000. I don't think they want me taking a DNA sample of that cup.
Scrape a little bit out of there.
the liability and all that.
Yeah.
So what I did was I lobbied and I brought these issues up to Fish and Wildlife Service, and we were successful in adding the white rhino to the endangered species list under similarity of appearance. And so now it doesn't really matter. In addition, some of the fallout from the crash, a large number of states started implementing bans on the sale of ivory and rhino horns in their states after all the attention got brought up. But anyway, to get back to the whole cup thing, I think is a much bigger problem issue. And in crash, what they do from China is they call them bosses, but the bosses would send or have individuals here in the United States basically looking for rhino horns or rhino cups. And so they had brokers, for lack of a better term, that would either through the web or online, internet, auction, place in Missouri, wherever it would be. There's people everywhere, scouts out looking for product. And all that stuff was going back or heading to Southeast Asia, in particular Vietnam and China, Hong Kong, and those sorts of places.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I mean, most of the people I've talked to on this podcast have been dealing more with the rhino poaching in Africa and the trade from that side, but you don't think about all the horn that's out there already, or maybe even being brought in different ways through the States or Europe or somewhere like that, where these syndicates are also operating and finding other ways to purchase and transport. And same thing too, talking about the libation cups. I mean, that's kind of what the gist I've gotten is that most of these kind of extreme high prices for rhino horn isn't typically raw rhino horn or ground rhino horn, but it's something that's been turned into either an art piece or a status symbol that becomes like, an investment or showing off how rich you are through this carved piece that's been created out of the horn. And that's where the really high prices are fetched.
Yeah, well, I think it coincides. I mean, with this sort of newfound wealth. I mean, that's why I think Vietnam is an important player right now. The millennial age, they have this. A lot of them have money now that they didn't have years ago. And I think the end users have been sort of fluctuated through the years. I think at one time, I think Japan was a significant player in the rhinos, and maybe Taiwan and some others, and then it sort of transcends to currently, particularly Vietnam and probably China. But it's a status symbol. People have money to burn. I mean, when you're paying $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 for a cup to sit on your mantle, you got money, and unfortunately, that sort of plays into the problem there that we see in Africa is that no one's really talking or addressing the socioeconomic crisis that, to me, it makes no sense. I know we've heard these, well, let's cut the horns off and that'll save the rhino. Well, that's not going to save the rhino. I know there's countries that want to sell their sea stock and flood the market. Well, that's not going to save the rhino. And so we got to address the socioeconomic issues and the fact that when a villager or a person can get into a park and in one kill make more money than he would ever make working a real job, there's all the incentive in the world. I mean, if I'm going to take care of my family and that's the most important thing to me, those things are going to drive these people to do bad things, and so we got to figure out how we can change that issue. But as it relates to flooding the market and the supply, well, they tried that with elephant ivory, I think, and twice CITES allowed certain countries to sell stockpiles under the premise that you flood the market, the price will go down, and they don't want to poach anymore. Well, we still got 30,000 elephants being killed every year, and that hasn't worked. And I think the same would be happening with the rhinos. The problem is, I say, John, here's two rhinos. One of them is cut off, black rhino out of Kruger, and one of them it come from a farm up the road from a rhino farmer. I lay them on your desk and say, one of them you can sell and one of them you can't. I dare you to try to tell me which one. And so what happens is, and the other thing is, people, as long as we allow there to be some sort of market for this stuff, you're always going to create this perception in the public that that's pretty cool. I'd like to have that, or maybe someday if I had enough money, maybe I'll get me one of those. And you constantly fuel this desire for this stuff.
People love rare things too. The perverse angle of it is, someone might be like, this one was killed in the park, this one is farmed. Someone might be like, well, the one killed in the park, that's a little more special. That's that's more rare. And
I can
so
assure you there's plenty of people like that. I've come across many of those.
yeah.
The rarer it is, the more they want it, and the higher the price they pay for it. And so thus the cycle continues.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's the combination of, like you were saying, it's more the social economic situations in a lot of these countries where they're being poached is people need real opportunities to have livings,
Right.
and they need to be more connected and have ownership of that wildlife and those resources as well. So they care about it. And then on the other end, it's, trying to somehow educate people that, and I don't know, maybe from your interactions, you have experience talking to some of these criminals, or maybe, I mean, I think the people running the syndicates are just making money and they're greedy, but someone that might be buying this is, who knows, a status symbol or an investment, might not be considering the violent death that this rhino had, or the death that this ranger had because some syndicate came to take him out because he was protecting these. And if there was a way to put that in front of people's faces, they might be less likely or more hesitant to actually participate in this type of trade. So it seems like it's a combination of the both.
I agree. I think out of sight, out of mind. People don't think about it or don't want to think about it. God forbid you put a post on out there with a rhino with his head hacked off and stumbling around in the bush, still alive. People don't want to see that, and social media won't let you put it out, and so people just sort of don't really put two and two together about that beautiful trinket I see under glass there in some fancy store in Milan or some other location. I mean, that ivory bracelet or whatever it may be, they don't really have a concept about what it took to get that. I mean, I remember when I was a wildlife inspector, there was a particular shipment I intercepted in the mail, and it was elephant tusk made into bottle openers. What was so appalling about this was these were from infant elephants. The tusks were only several inches in length, and the bottle opener was. So these elephants, I don't remember how many, but let's half a dozen or so elephants died for a bottle opener. And I'm sure somebody would think, oh, that's cool to have and put on my bar and blah, blah, blah. But are you kidding me? I mean, and so that's where going and interacting with the people there and talking and just sort of, people have to have a better understanding. And I think, I give a lot of credit again to the men and women on the front lines there in Africa who are trying to deal with this issue. It's dangerous. Sometimes it feels like you're not going to win the battle, but without them and without us doing what we're doing, many of these species would probably already be gone.
Well, I mean, you kind of answered this, but as we're getting close to the end here, what keeps you going? I mean, you've had this long career with a lot of amazing successes over the years. You retired, putting little air quotes out there, and then you've consulted. You've come on with a Focus Conservation to help their efforts. Why do you keep coming back to this and doing this, even in spite of all these challenges?
I don't know. I mean, it's just something ingrained in me. I've thought about it. I mean, my wife's like, I thought you were supposed to be retired and enjoying yourself. And why are you all stressed out about this or that? Because I get worked up about this stuff because it bugs me. Somebody's got to be the voice. I'm not doing this alone. There's a lot of people that have done way more than I have. But I think it goes back to my early days. I mean, my dad, my love for animals, it's just something that's a part of me. And I don't think it'll never leave me. And as long as I am still relevant and able to help, I want to help. It's just, I'm getting ready to have some grandkids, and I hope that I can excite my grandkids about animals. I can't wait to take them to the zoo. I didn't mention this, but I mean, religiously, we went to the St. Louis Zoo because one, it didn't cost anything to go in. So, for a family that didn't have a whole lot, that was very appealing to us. But it was a great zoo besides the fact that it was for free. And so I spent my whole childhood going to the zoo, and that transcended to my wife and kids. That was what we did as a family. We would go to zoos around the country. And to this day, I currently sit on the conservation board for the Nashville Zoo. I involved with them now for a few years. And of course, I've seen my share, plenty of really bad zoos and zoos that should not be called a zoo. But then there are those that are heavily involved in conservation. And so and Nashville Zoo is one of those zoos. And I'm very proud to be a part of what they're doing in the conservation work, because they actually go out and send their keepers to various countries to work with, research, and sort of have an appreciation for the animals that they're working with there at the zoo. And so, yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just something. I've been like this my entire life. I don't see myself doing anything different. Animals, I get all excited about animals. Even I go to the zoo today, and I'd be just like when I was 6 years old, walking there holding my mom and dad's hand. I mean, it's cool. And there's something cool about animals that once you give them a chance and you learn about them, and they're just fascinating. And to me, I always say, Mother Nature. You think about Mother Nature and how these things evolved, and whether it's their color patterns, whether it's their certain limbs or the reproduction, and I mean, all those things is just really cool. It's fascinating, and there's so many neat and fascinating animals out there, and they all deserve a chance. And so, yeah, I'm just while I still can, and while somebody wants to listen to me, I'll still keep trying to speak on their behalf.
What advice would you give for someone that's aspiring to go into a similar field that you chose, whether that's wildlife investigation or being involved in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service somehow, kind of that area of focus? What would you tell someone that's starting out?
I have that asked all the time. And I mean, one of the things I tell everyone is you can't give up. If this is really what you want to do, you got to figure out a way to make it work. And it's not always going to be easy. You're going to have your set of challenges. You're going to have doors slammed in your face. It's like a lot of professions. And this is no different. But if you're really passionate about this stuff, you just can't give up, and you got to keep trying. Obviously, being educated, learning about the issues. For me, I don't know if sort of gets off a little bit of a segue, but for me, I always, particularly as it relates to college kids, I volunteered throughout most of my college summers when I was off. I volunteered for wildlife agencies, organizations, and while others felt it was important to go and work a job and make a bunch of money and this and that, I took the take. This was my opportunity to get experience, to learn as much as I can. And so even for nothing, I volunteered for the U.S. Forest Service. I worked with a bunch of different agencies in the wildlife arena. Then when I graduated, I had a whole bunch of things that I already had experience with, where the person decided to hammer nails or flip hamburgers. They didn't have they might have the same degree, but not the same experience. And so be willing to do some sacrificing if that's what you want to do, and hopefully at some point there'll be a payoff. It doesn't always happen, and as we said, you'll meet some T intersections, and you may end up taking the wrong one, and things turn a different way for you. But if it's meant to be, it's probably going to happen. So just don't give up. Particularly if you're passionate about this stuff.
Yeah, that's good advice. And I feel like with those experiences, you learn so much, and it's a part of it's just building that network of like-minded friends and people that might help you out down the road in your career in ways you can't even think of. So, I mean, even with this film, RHINO Man, and this podcast, I mean, I'm pretty much volunteering here, guys. If you don't know it, it's like, so yeah, if you're passionate about it, you kind of just have to do it. You can't wait for someone to give you permission.
But you're playing an important role. You're playing an important role in getting the message out there, talking about Anton, talking about the other rangers that, just like me, they put on their pants and put their belt on and put the gun on their side and go out that door, not knowing if today's the day. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. You don't know. But you're telling that story because not a lot of people have told that story, nor do people understand what they do. And you kind of alluded to it earlier about, they think all you do is go out and check to make sure they got a license or not too many shotgun shells. Well, that's the perception a lot of people have with this, because nobody's telling the story like you and a few others are telling. And so I think what you're doing is extremely important. I think the media and all the different medias, whether it be news articles and magazines, film, I've been involved in a number of film projects, only from the standpoint, I think that's all part of this process. I can go out and catch a bad guy and I go home and never tell anybody or do anything about it. Other than that bad guy, no one's even going to know or care about the issue, and so you got to raise these issues. And I think that's what we did with Crash, and that's what we did with Wazachroma. That's what we've done with a bunch of these big cases, is we try to get the word out. And, it's not self-serving and it's not to pat yourself on the back because it's all a team effort anyway. It's never one individual. But to me, it's getting the message out. And as I said from the beginning, when people talk about animals, it's easy. It's easy to sell animals. I mean, people love animals. And if people understand what's happening to them, that gets them more interested in doing something about it. And slowly, I think the tide is turning and people are becoming more and more interested in this stuff. But just like Marlon Perkins did for me with Mutual Homeowners Wild Kingdom, I mean, hopefully you'll do that with somebody who's watching your film and you leave that same impression on them. And maybe one day they want to be a wildlife ranger or a wildlife officer or go to travel to Africa or do those sort of things just because they saw your movie.
Yeah, we hope we can have impact, and even just, sharing your story and the things that you've done over the years and have been involved in. I think it's super inspiring for people to hear those. And it's important for us to get these stories out there to have some kind of impact and make people aware and get people involved as well. So, kind of wrapping up with focused conservation moving forward, I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of what you guys are hoping to achieve. And then maybe lastly, is there any way people can get supported or find you guys online to, even if it's donating to help the cause? Because as we were talking earlier, it's not easy for NGOs to make it, and there's so much work to be done. But the reality is people need funds. So if people can, love them to help.
Yeah, I mean, I'm moving forward with focused conservation. I'm really excited about some of the things they want to do. We're going to continue to work with our wildlife crime units. We're going to continue to work with our law enforcement partners on investigations. We're going to continue working these training opportunities. For me personally, what I'm hoping to bring to focus is an awareness to the organization. Look, cops in general, and these guys are no different than myself. You kind of get tunnel vision, and all you care about is what it takes to catch that bad guy. And you're not worried about fundraising or getting a press release put together or doing an interview or a podcast, or you're not interested in soliciting donations. All you want to do is catch that bad guy. And that's fine. And that's why we were probably, most of us within focused conservation have been so successful in our careers. But unfortunately, the way the NGO world works, those things are really important. And so what I hope to bring to focus is the ability to talk about wildlife trafficking, talk about focused conservation, talk about some of the great cases being made by our wildlife crime units under the guidance of our technical advisors. I want to, make sure that people are following us and liking us and interacting with us through our social media. You can find Focused Conservation on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We have a website. We're getting ready to relaunch our website. So the way it looks today is not the way it'll look down the road. There will be a donation page on the website, and people can, if they want to support Focus in any way, they can certainly, we'll accept donations to help with some of these projects that we're involved in. We'll continue to be involved in various campaigns, grants, and projects. We want to expand, I think, probably a little bit beyond Africa. Right now, there's so much work that can be done in Africa. It's kind of by default kept us there. But I do know from my own experiences, there's some places that can really use help from an organization like Focused Conservation. Places in Southeast Asia, places in Central and South America, in particular. So we're hoping to raise awareness to the organization, get people interested, because as I said, these guys kind of just been moving along and doing their thing and not really getting too focused on all that other stuff. But I think, I don't have the statistics in front of me, but like our crime units, we've only had crime units since 2018, and we only have 5. And basically 2 of them are brand new. But I believe there was somewhere in the neighborhoods of close to 750 law enforcement operations since 2018, and over 400 arrests that have been made in the last 4 to 5 years by these crime units that we're affiliated with. We've seized live chimpanzees, live brown hyenas. We've seized numerous pangolins and gray parrots and shark fins and abalone and ivory and rhino horn and In Kenya, the work they're doing in Kenya with sandalwood. I mean, they've seized, I believe, somewhere around 38 to 39,000 kilograms of sandalwood. And all this stuff is not getting any attention. And not our guys aren't asking for it, but if people really do the kind of work that they're doing, and when I say our guys, I'm talking about these are guys from, agencies within Uganda, Liberia, Nigeria. I mean, they're our guys. We're working with them, but they belong to another agency. Those guys are in the background or in the shadows, not getting any credit, no notoriety, just day to day doing their thing because they care about these critters. And so, but when you start, as I have now that I've been immersed with Focus for a few months and start seeing, reading, learning, and talking to these individuals, I'm amazed at the work that's being done by Focus Conservation, and nobody really knows about it. And so my goal is to raise the awareness, encourage people to support Focus. Hopefully we will be able to continue. Unfortunately, when you're an NGO or a nonprofit, you live day to day or year to year, and you just don't know what's going to happen next. It would be unfortunate if we were to go away tomorrow because I think the work that we're doing with these task force and with these other investigations, so forth, is really critical in this global effort to address wildlife trafficking and disrupting these transnational organizations that are involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely, Tim. And I can't thank you enough for coming on the show and sharing your story and what you guys are doing at Focus Conservation. Really hope people continue to follow you guys and help support because, I think it's just the more you get into this world of conservation and protecting wildlife in these natural spaces, the more you realize that there's, all these different parts to play. And without, these types of investigations that you're doing, it's really difficult for someone like a ranger that, that we're following in our film to have a long-term effect because they're kind of just swatting flies while there's, kind of the mothership over here of the crime syndicates that are operating on a higher level that they can't really reach without the support of organizations like your own. So I really appreciate the work you're doing, and thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. It's been a real treat, and I look forward to being able to see your film one day. I think it's an important film. I think anyone that cares about wildlife and conservation needs to understand what these rangers are going through. And I think it's very cool that somebody has taken an interest in telling their story because it doesn't get told very often.
Yeah, appreciate that, Tim. We'll make sure you get to see it soon. Thank you.
All right, I will.
Cheers. Thank you for listening to the RHINO Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at RHINO Man the Movie. More details about RHINO Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who've dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simone Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for RHINO Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonewilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the RHINO Man Podcast.